So my name is Thomas Fazi. I'm an Anglo-Italian journalist and writer and researcher. And we're here in Tolfa, the first edition of the Tolfa International Forum. And along with some of the greatest critical journalists and analysts that we have today in Europe and the West more in general, we have been discussing what's going on around the world. Obviously, I've been focusing here in Tolfa on, of course, the major, as a lot of us have, on the major hotspots today in the world. So we've been talking, as one might imagine, a lot about Russia, Ukraine, about what's happening in Gaza, about what's the current state of the relations between the U.S. and China, and more in general about how. About this profound geopolitical shift that the world is undergoing, and the potentially positive outcomes that it might have, but also the very tragic consequences that it's having in the short term. If we look at the events of the past few years, I think one of the most astonishing aspects has been the way in which Europe and European countries and European politicians have simply parroted the US-NATO line when it comes not just to Ukraine, but also Gaza and China, and most of the major geopolitical issues today in the world. And so today, one might say that Europe is more subordinated geopolitically, but also economically, to the US than it's probably ever been since the post-war period. And this is it's been quite incredible to witness, especially if we consider that, at least in the short term, the proxy war, the NATO proxy war in Ukraine has clearly benefited the US in many ways, but the same cannot be said for Europe, which is paying a very high price in economic terms, but also in geopolitical terms, in terms of becoming increasingly irrelevant on the wider sort of chessboard, global chessboard, and it's especially interesting if we consider that America's benefits have been at the expense of Europe. And I would say that one of the aims, one of the goals of the US in this war has been specifically not just to weaken Russia, but also to weaken Europe and sort of drive a wedge between Europe and Russia, and especially Germany and Russia. And while the war might appear to have failed on other fronts, it has clearly been a big success from America's standpoint in this respect. And so when you consider just how damaging this war has been to Europe's wider geopolitical interests, one cannot help but ask oneself, how is this possible? How is it possible that European politicians have just gone along with this policy against the interests of their own country, of their own peoples, and of the continent more in general? And I think part of the answer lies in the very deep and profound influence that America, still exercises in Europe, 80 years after the end of World War II. And there are a number of ways through which America exercises its influence. Of course, there are, deep institutional linkages between the American, especially intelligence and military apparatuses, and the European intelligence and military apparatuses, through NATO and other organizations. But it's not just that. It's also a cultural influence that America is able to wield through its control of the sort of European intellectual ecosystem, which is very much influenced by the Anglo-American world, if we consider that English is the lingua franca in Europe. And European elites are much more influenced by Anglo-American media and Anglo-American think tanks than they are by their own national media and their own think tanks. And when you look at all the major foreign policy and security think tanks that are very present in Western media, European media more specifically, we see that they all have ties to the US government, they all have ties to the US State Department, they're all funded by the US in one way or another. And these are the think tanks and the media organizations from which a lot of European politicians are taking their talking points and are influenced more in general. And so there's really been a sort of a cultural colonization of Europe by the kind of Anglo-American empire, which continues to this day, and I think we're suffering the consequences of this sort of cultural colonization that Europe has experienced over the past 80 years, and that in many respects today is stronger than it's ever been. Europe is sort of occupied by the U.S. in many respects. I mean, first of all, one could say that it's technically occupied in the sense that we still have a huge U.S. military presence in Europe that was established after the Second World War, especially in the countries that emerged that were defeated during the war. So Germany and Italy, but also a number of other countries. And people say, oh, but they're here, upon the invitation of European governments. But I think this is very naive. A lot of the American presence is a result of deals that were signed in the aftermath of World War II, many of which are still confidential to this day. And I think it would be, it's very naive to say that any country that wants to leave NATO is free to do so. We know that in the past, NATO established behind the lines clandestine paramilitary organizations such as Gladio and other organizations that had the specific goal of preventing any European country of breaking away from the transatlantic alliance. So that in itself shows that we haven't entered these agreements as a result of our own free will. These were agreements that were imposed upon Europe, upon European nations after World War II. And are maintained up to this day as a result of the very kind of uneven relations that characterize the relationship between European countries and the United States. And this is not even considering the kind of stick and carrot approach that the U.S. has vis-a-vis European politicians, whereby you can be severely punished for stepping out of line, for daring to defy the kind of transatlantic alliance. While you will be generously rewarded if you toe the transatlantic party line. And we see this in a way that many politicians, once they finish their term in office in Europe, then go off to work for big U.S. investment banks or international organizations, U.S.-controlled organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank, or via very lucrative positions within the European Union. And the European Union is also another very important factor in terms of how the U.S. controls Europe. So the narrative that we've been hearing for a very long time, in fact, one of the sort of justifications for the creation of the European Union was that it was going to be a counterbalance to American power, and that it was going to make Europe more autonomous from America. This is this was especially this was kind of the left wing pro-EU narrative in the early days of the European Union. Well, look, 30 years down the road, if we want to sort of signal the beginning of the European Union with the Maastricht Treaty, what do we see? We see a Europe, as I was saying, that is more subordinated to the US than ever. And I think the European Union plays a very important role in this respect. By placing people in positions of power that are close to American interests, for example, at the European Commission, and Ursula von der Leyen is obviously the most clear example of that. Someone who's dedicated all her term in office to align the EU and thus all European countries with sort of America's wider geostrategic interests. We see that the European Union has actually played a very crucial role in maintaining European countries subordinated to the US, and so it's actually had the opposite effect of what we were told the European Union was supposed to bring about. But again, as I was saying, it's not just a military occupation, so to speak. It's also a cultural occupation, which manifests itself, through the various forms of cultural influence that the US has in Europe. And so, yes, you could say that in some ways Europe is still kind of colonized by America, all these years after the end of World War II. When I think of Ukraine's strategy in the Russia-Ukraine war, it strikes me as profoundly irrational, in a sense that it's Ukraine's official goal of retaking every inch of Russian annexed territory, so Crimea and the eastern regions of the Donbass and the other oblasts. It's not only is it completely unrealistic from a military standpoint, as has become apparent over the past more than 2.5 years, and as was always unrealistic. Was never possible. Anyone that had a basic understanding of the kind of the demographics of Russia and Ukraine and the relative kind of military production capacities, etc., could have told you that that the goal of retaking those territories, even with NATO's support, was always going to be unrealistic. And in fact, pushing for Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, and actually forcing Ukraine, I would say, to adopt this kind of maximalist strategy by the West has been absolutely disastrous for Ukraine. We know that Ukraine was offered what, compared to anything the Ukraine is likely to obtain today, would have been a very generous offer. This peace deal that Russia and Ukraine were in the process of sketching out in the early weeks of the invasion, until the Western powers stepped in and told Ukraine to stop negotiating. That deal, compared to anything that Ukraine could get today, would have been a very generous deal. So that strategy has always been extremely unrealistic from a military standpoint, and I think it has been criminal for the West to kind of push Ukraine in that direction, despite knowing full well, I think, in Western military and policy, making circles, that was never a realistic policy. But the purpose was simply to, make the war go on for as long as possible in order to, bleed Russia, even though that strategy hasn't worked out very well from a Western U.S. standpoint. But aside from the military aspect of it, what strikes me as even more interesting is that it really makes no sense, even from a nation-building, a Ukrainian perspective. If we consider that one of the problems, Ukraine has always been defined as a kind of failed state in many respects. It's never had the kind of basic preconditions that are necessary to be defined as a nation state, largely due to the fact that the country has always been sort of culturally and very clearly divided between the kind of Western regions, and which have always been more pro-Western, more westward looking, and the Eastern regions, which have always historically had strong ties to Russia, and where many people actually define themselves as being Russians, and so the idea that the sort of the post-2014 regime that has taken hold in Ukraine, which has been in the process of transforming Ukraine into this ultra-nationalist, pro-West looking, rabidly anti-Russian entity, which has been hard at work to purge any elements of Russian culture from Ukraine, purging Russian language, purging Russian, even the sort of Russian-linked Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and basically trying to purge every aspect of Russian culture from Ukrainian life. Why, if that's been the strategy, how does it make sense to want to retake regions where the people that live there would not want to be part of what Ukraine has become? They might have been happy being part of Ukraine, up until 2014, but the sentiments are now very different, and the overwhelming majority of people that live in those regions now, would rather prefer to be part of Russia than to be part of what Ukraine has become, and so what Ukraine retaking those regions would entail would in fact be that would entail sort of placing these people under foreign occupation, because these are peoples that do not want to be part of the new regime that has taken hold in Ukraine, and so. But more in general, if your aim is to create this more culturally coherent country, in a way you could argue Ukraine now has a chance by getting rid of the kind of pro-Russian or outright Russian regions. Ukraine now has a chance to start, for the first time ever, a true kind of nation-building project. Having purged those elements that are necessarily incompatible with that project. Ukraine now finally has a chance to create an ideologically, culturally coherent nation, westward-looking nation. So, what would, from a nation-building perspective, the goal of retaking those regions really doesn't make much sense at all, and appears actually quite irrational to me. So, one of the main narratives that we keep hearing in the West, in order to justify Western support for Ukraine, is that we're simply helping Ukrainians achieve what they want. That all Ukrainians want to fight Russia, whatever it takes. And I'm more than happy to support the Zelensky government's goal of retaking every inch of lost territory. And so we're simply helping, we're simply giving the Ukrainians what they want. We've kept hearing this, over the past 2.5 years. But in fact, even polls that have been carried out in Ukraine recently show that there are large swathes of the population, and according to some polls, a majority of the population that now that supports some form of a peace negotiation, a peace deal that wants an end to this war. But of course, if the next question in this poll happens to be, would you be willing to give up some of the lost territories in order to achieve peace, then everyone answers no. And so this would appear kind of contradictory, right? Because I mean, if you're I think everyone realizes that that's the only condition at which some form of territorial concession will be needed in order to reach a negotiation with Russia. And I think the way to reconcile these two apparently contradictory answers is that Ukrainians are not free to openly state that they would be willing, if not happy, to cede part of their territories in order to achieve peace. And that's because, far from being this shining beacon of democracy that we're told Ukraine is, Ukraine today has descended into a, I would say, quasi-totalitarian dictatorship where people are not free to express their opinion, especially concerning the war. In fact, anyone that dares to say that Ukraine should give up certain territories is likely to be tried for treason, for high treason. And there have been cases of ordinary Ukrainian citizens discussing this issue on even private WhatsApp groups, or even just among casual conversations with their friends or colleagues, who have faced criminal trials on charges of treason, of sort of supporting the Russian regime. And so these polls aren't cannot be trusted, because the truth is, I think that obviously I can't speak for Ukrainians, but I would imagine that there's at least a significant portion of the population today in Ukraine that would be happy to see peace on almost any terms. And also another aspect of this narrative that's clearly disproven by events on the ground is the huge number of people that have left the country. We've got a huge number of Ukrainian males that have left the country. We know that now the Ukrainian government is forced to resort to press gangs, to drag people off the street, to send them to the front. This doesn't strike me as a country that is united in this this war effort, that is united in obtaining these maximalist goals at every cost, even if it means destroying an entire generation, or at this point more than a single generation of Ukrainians. And so I think what we don't realize is that the so-called friends of Ukraine, the ones that claim to support Ukraine by sending more weapons, by supporting them, or actually pushing them harder and harder, towards taking a confrontational attitude towards Russia, actually I would say Ukraine's greatest enemies. They are the ones that are that have already caused Ukraine huge damage, that have already caused a huge loss of life in Ukraine, and that now are really pushing Ukraine to the brink of complete destruction. I belong to that minority of people that comes from the left. So historically, I've always positioned myself on the socialist left, who today find themselves completely at odds with what the left has become in the West, and specifically in Europe. I think I would say, I think quite a lot of other people, despite coming from the left, I feel completely politically homeless, because I'm completely aghast at the state of the left today and what the left has become, which I would say at this point has very little to do with what the left traditionally has been. So the kind of the contemporary left has little, if any, relation to the socialist or even social democratic or labor left, working class left that existed in Europe, I would say, up until the 80s and maybe even early 90s. Today, that was a left that on a number of crucial issues had ideas that were completely at odds with the idea, with the positions that the left has today. So, for example, let's take the European Union. So today, anyone that criticizes the European Union is accused of being on the right, because most of the ones that today are critical of the European Union are on the right. And even though that's true, I find that the argument that if you criticize the European Union, then you must be on the right, to be kind of amusing, because in fact, again, up until the 80s, most of the socialist and communist parties in Europe were strongly opposed to the European Union. They saw the European Union for what it is, this kind of elite-driven, top-down, capitalist oligarchic project, anti-democratic project, and they opposed it. In my country, Italy, the most kind of sovereigntist party that we've ever had was the Italian Communist Party, which is the only party to have voted against every European treaty, all the way from the Treaty of Rome to 57 up until the Treaty of Maastricht of 92. So there was until not too long ago, there was a time when the left understood the importance of national sovereignty, understood the importance of national democracy, understood the importance that democracy, especially mass working class democracy, can only occur at the at the national level. And that the supranationalization of politics, the internationalization of politics, is the death of democracy and is the death of politics, and especially of working class politics. All those, all these understandings have been completely lost by the contemporary left, which started embracing these ideas of supranationalization back in the 80s, and this gets us to where we are today, where we see that most of the left in Europe, not just the mainstream left, but even the so-called radical left, tends to support the European Union and have favorable views of the European Union, and in fact, accuses anyone that criticizes those institutions of being, a dangerous nationalist, a dangerous, xenophobic sovereigntist or whatever. And I think this is just one of the examples of just how much the left has gone astray and has distanced itself from the from the old school left. And now what the left has become is something that has nothing to do with working class politics, as the left used to be. Now it's a vehicle for the kind of intellectual elites, for the progressive intellectual elites, for the middle, the intellectual middle classes, to in fact to police the working classes, to keep the working classes down by establishing the boundaries of what is the acceptable discourse in politics. And I think that's I would go as far as saying that today the left is the main enemy of the working classes, because precisely because they are the ones that establish the boundaries of acceptable politics. And so I think the time has come for those of us who come from the old school left and in many ways are still wedded to that vision to those visions of justice, of egalitarianism, and so on, to really go beyond that kind of left-right 20th century dichotomy, which I think has become completely obsolete. I think this dichotomy is today used, is one of the most powerful weapons that are used to divide the working classes, and I think we really got to go beyond that. I think we need to build a new political language, a new political dictionary, and in many ways a new political vision that remains true to those ideals, but gets rid of the kind of aesthetic and historical baggage that those ideas come with.